we have been talking about special servants in our class on Sunday mornings. Thus far, we've had 7 or 8 classes, and all of those have focused on elders, deacons, and evangelists, and especially discussing the work and purpose of those special servants. This morning we're going to do something a little different, though, and we want to talk about authority. Now, when I say authority, if you immediately think I'm going to start talking about like command and example and a bunch of other stuff like that, that's not what we're talking about. That's not like how we decide what is right and wrong and what we should do or not do as a congregation. That is not the authority that I'm talking about this morning that we're going to discuss. The concept of authority this morning that we want to talk about related to special servants is, why do they have authority? Why do special servants have greater, you might say, responsibility, but also a level of authority in order to lead differently than, call it, the average member? And why is that the case? And so the biggest thing I want to say about this is we're not going to walk away from this study with elders, deacons, evangelists have the authority to do X, and they don't have the authority to do Y. We're not going to, that's not the sort of concrete definition of authority that we're going to get today. Instead, we really want to have a goal of understanding how their authority is established, and when and where should we see that? All right? So we're actually going to cover more material than we've covered in any other class. So I'm going to just jump in, and if I cut off conversation, that's not normal for me. It's because I really want to get through everything we have to talk about this morning. So the first thing we're going to do is look at Matthew 20 and 25, 20 through verse 25. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom." And Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." And he said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. But Jesus called to them and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them." You're going to want to get the handouts on that page right there, on that right there. "Lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many." All right, I want to take a minute or two. There's 1 or 2 questions that you can take note of as you're kind of thinking about this passage, and really think about authority. What does this passage teach us about authority, and what might it reveal about their thoughts about authority in the kingdom? We'll take 2 minutes for you all to make notes. All right, so first let's summarize what we see in Matthew 20. So what happens here?
The mother of the sons of Zebedee comes and makes a request to Jesus.
All right, that's a great first step. The mother of the sons of Zebedee makes a request, and I think we could say it's a pretty bold request. "I want my sons to sit at your right hand and your left hand." All right, and then what happens? Julie?
It's not his to decide.
Yeah, so Jesus says, "It's not mine to give," and what else does he say?
He says, "Are you ready to drink what I'm going to drink?"
Yeah, so it's not mine to give. I have a lot of questions about why it's not his to give, and if you have those too, I hope you answer them and come explain it to me later. I haven't figured that out yet. He says that they're going to need to drink from his cup. I think that's a very clear reference to his death and the night in the garden before his crucifixion. And what else? What else happened? It's not his to give. And what? Chip?
Statement before that, you don't even know what you're asking. Basically, you don't understand what you're asking for.
Yeah. So you don't understand what you're asking for. And if you did, I think the implication is you might not ask for what you're asking for if you did understand. What else can we tell about, I'm going to call her Mother Zebedee here, and what she's asking for? What does it reveal about her, Belinda?
She doesn't understand the nature of the kingdom.
Man, that's so. Did you see my notes? Did I have that up there? She clearly didn't understand the nature of the kingdom. Now, I want to cut her some slack because, nobody understood the nature of the kingdom, right? All the issues that, the apostles didn't get it. It seems that they didn't get it until days after Jesus' crucifixion, right? So to expect someone like their mother who's not with them Jesus all the time to get it, that may be a bit punitive to expect.
The reference they have is King David, King Solomon, all the kings they've had. That's what the reference is, the kingdom.
Yes. So when Jesus responds, he says, I don't think you're actually going to want this cup that I have. But she wasn't asking for the cup, as he put it. What was she asking for? Position. Yes. She was interested in position. And I think we can interpret that further and say, when says she was interested in position, what was she interested in? Wayne?
I think about people who had a position next to a king, which would be like Joseph, like Daniel, like the people that were put second in command. That's what she wanted. Something that said, oh, this is going to be, like when Moses.
But why? Why did she want that to? So they could help rule. She wanted her sons to have power or authority. By the way, I looked at a bunch of definitions on power and authority. Lots of people will tell you there's a difference in them. I struggle to understand the difference. They're very related. So we're not going to talk about did she want power, did she want authority. They're like 80 or 90% synonyms. Brian?
Yeah, I was still on that. She was wanting exaltation rather than what is addressed later on.
Yeah, she's wanting her sons to be lifted up into a position of power because that's what people want. And so, what does Jesus say after he talks about the cup? What does he say about this type of position? Yeah.
Exercising authority over, and then he says, but it shall not be so among you. But then gives the opposing, or what it seems to be the opposing view perspective of kingdom authority, which is servitude.
Yeah.
By the ones who are in that position of authority are serving, not ruling over or exalted above.
Great. So Jesus rebukes them and he makes this comparative. The leaders of the Gentiles lord it over them. They exercise authority over those that are under them. Don't be like that. That's not what authority in the kingdom of Christ is. It's about something totally different. And that's right where Micah took us. And that's that leadership in the kingdom is different. And what's it based on? Service. It's about service. Yes, sir.
I think it's compelling to look at the reason for the rebuke that Jesus gives there in verse 25 and verse 24. It's because the 10 who had heard what was asked becomes indigent, as the ESV says, to the two that were asking the question. We see Jesus trying to keep his apostles together. And here we see a portion or a time where the apostles aren't getting along over what somebody has asked or requested to Jesus. And it brings some animosity that we see there. And Jesus has to stop that, and he does it quickly.
Yeah. So the 10 are indignant about the fact that Mother Zebedee is asked about this for her sons. I don't know if they're indignant that she asked or they're indignant that their moms didn't ask first. We don't get that clarity. We just know they're indignant about the situation. So yeah, Jesus immediately silences that, and he explains that in the kingdom, the basis for leadership, the basis for authority, for the position, is one about sacrifice, about slavery. That the one that should be first will be the one that serves. That's a completely different concept than what the Gentiles thought. And I think it's ironic that he references the Gentiles, because I think you could say the exact same thing about the leaders of the Jews. The Pharisees clearly enjoyed position and power and lording it over people. I don't know why he referenced Gentiles versus Jews. Maybe it was he didn't want to create controversy and have an argument over what the Pharisees did or didn't do. So he chose a point that no one would argue with in the world of the Jewish people. You know them Gentiles, how they do this. Well, you can't be like that. The concept of authority is different in the kingdom. And so I think it's important that we compare this as we think about our special servants. So take a step back and you think about elections in our country. So you go back to 2015. Before Donald Trump was elected president, he had no authority or power to make any laws or tell anyone in the government what to do. And then he was inaugurated in January of 2016, or January 2017, and immediately, that moment, he was bestowed with authority and power to make decisions. He could issue executive orders. He could effectively direct regulatory departments to do certain things, right? So when we think about position and authority and power and all those things in our government, which is the touchstone that lots of times we have, the day you take an office, your level of power and authority changes. So I think it's important that we consider, is that what happens here? When we appoint special servants, do they have no authority on day 0 or day -1 before they've been appointed? And then on day 0, day 1, when they've been appointed, now they have significant authority and the ability to do all kinds of things. If for some reason that special servant needs to step down, I'm not saying because they've sinned and or anything like that, but they need to step down, do they lose all their authority? I think those are questions we don't often consider, but it's important to think about them in that way, because we need to understand if our concept of authority in God's kingdom, and specifically in our group, is one that's related to an office. Does an elder or a deacon or an evangelist have authority because they fill an office that, like the president, from day -1 to day 1, all their authority and ability changes? Or are we in something different? My thinking is that we're in something different. So let's look at a couple verses to talk about that real quick. So first, 1 Timothy 4:12. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in conduct, in love, and faith, in purity. So Paul tells Timothy these 5 things he's supposed to give and be an example in for all those that he's around and teaching. That is sandwiched within all of this other discussion of Timothy's duties as an evangelist and comes right after he is told to do the work of an evangelist. I think the concept of these 5 example points are key to whether or not Timothy can actually do his work. 1 Peter 5:3, we looked at this last week and the week before, regarding elders, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. 2 Corinthians 1:24, Paul says, not that we lord it over your faith, but we work with you for your joy, for you stand firm in your faith. I really like this one. I think, Julie, you have the Holman Christian. What does it say, but we work for you, or we work with you for your faith? Does yours say something different? 1:24.
I do think that we lord it over your faith, but we are workers with you for your joy, because you stand firm in your faith.
But we are workers with you. I think if anybody has the New American Standard, it'll say, we are fellow workers with you for joy, for you stand firm in the faith. It's so interesting here that Paul, an apostle, when he talks about his relationship with authority to the Corinthians, he doesn't say, I make the decisions or I tell you what to do and you do it. Instead, he references their relationship as fellow workers, that relationship should bring joy, and that they stand firm in the faith. This really reminds me of when Jesus said, take my yoke upon you, you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That when you yoke up with Christ, that joint fellow workership is easy. It removes burden from you. It doesn't add burden to you. When Paul says this to the Corinthians, it reminds me of that as an apostle, as an early form in some ways of an elder that he sometimes provided, that what he references is something more like Jesus references when he says, take my yoke upon you. That the role of a special servant should be to come alongside the members and to say, take my yoke upon you. Let me ease your burden. Let us do this together, for we're fellow workers, and bring joy. Then Hebrews 13:7, remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. So when you take all of these things together, what does authority look like in the light of Matthew 20 and in the light of these 4 passages?
Shared service.
It looks like shared service. And I think those 2 words matter, right? It is both a shared duty that special servants are working with the members, and that it is service. It is servant related. It is not position, I tell you what to do and you do it. Crystal?
Sometimes when we think about sacrifice, we think about sacrificing other things, right? Sacrificing other people or animals or whatever. But the sacrifice here is talking about sacrificing for others, not for others.
Yeah, so in case you didn't hear Crystal, that we often think of sacrifice when we think of animal sacrifice or sacrificing people, like with Molech and all that. But here, this is sacrifice for others. I would say this is a sacrifice of yourself, that the special servant is putting themselves in a sacrificial place as opposed to requiring sacrifice from others. What else? Micah?
Just I guess the difference between going back to like how we in the fleshly world view authority versus what you see here. So like our focus, if we're saved, we're elected president, go back to that idea is like the focus is always on what can that person do? What do they have the power to do? It's about
Yeah,
Right.
their scope of authority is the way some people might put it in that realm.
Exactly. Versus these examples and these thought processes are more about what service can be provided through that work, through that role within the body. It's about how much can they help. So it's all about
Yeah.
service and servitude. How much
I like that idea that instead of thinking about how will they fill this office and what decisions or things do they have the authority to do, instead framing special servants and their authority as what will they bring to serve with, and how will they serve, and what will that look like when they serve? Or will it look like the Gentiles, where they lord it over the flock? They exercise authority in ways that may be more about authority than service. What else? Alan?
The authority to me, doesn't change. It's the same. When they're a servant, when they don't have the position, or they're a servant when they do have the position, the authority's still there.
All right, so Alan presents this idea that their authority doesn't change. I think that's an interesting thing to consider. First, I'll say I partially agree. And I want to caveat that, right? So when someone, and I'm going to reference back, I've done this a couple times, to They Smell Like Sheep, that book that some of us have read about leadership. One of my favorite things that book talks about is that when we're looking for, in this case, elders, but I think it applies to deacons and evangelists as well. But the language I'm going to use is going to focus on elders, so just kind of go with that. That when we look to appoint a man as an elder, as a shepherd, we should be able to identify the flock that they already lead. They don't lead the flock at large. So in our case, they don't lead Woodland Hills at large, but instead, they do lead some portion of the flock. Meaning some portion of the group looks to them for care, for protection, when they have spiritual questions and spiritual needs. And that action means that they, at minimum, have authority over that group. Because that flock is following them and listening to their voice. And in just a second, we're gonna read about the Good Shepherd as Jesus lays out in John 10. And this concept of listening to the voice. So that man is shepherding some group. And now when we say, hey, we've seen that Jim does this, and our request is that he now does it for all of us. So now, when we appoint Jim, what we're saying is the way he shepherded that small flock, that subset of the group, we now want him to do that for all of us. And in that way, just like the small group gave Jim, in this case, authority because they followed him, when we appoint a man as an elder, he has authority not because he's filled some office of power, but instead because we as a group have said, we want him to shepherd us. We want to follow his voice and hear him and go where he sends us. That's very different than a position granting one power when they take an office. David Lee?
Not disagreeing with that at all. But it's just listening to you sounds like you just, at least partially in my mind, defined power and authority and their differences. Where it's like, you may, for example, being Adam, have a level of power and influence that you make in this church among these people. Though maybe not endowed with any authority.
Yes.
You still have a lot of power potentially to impact the culture, to impact the things, the way that they're, whatever you do. And then what you were just describing is that there is maybe a level of authority that's given to you because people recognize, hey, this person has an influence. There is power to inflict, impact, change. way people think, the way people handle issues and problems, and can adapt as an organization. This person seems influential in that. As a result, we want to give that authority to do something with that power that they already possess based on how they've been acting.
Yeah, so you might not have been in here when I said I'm not going to do the difference between power and authority because I frankly don't understand it very well. And I'm not sure I can explain it. David Lee seems to grasp it, so go seek him after class. But the important part of what you said, David Lee, is that, to me, is we ask that person to serve. And so the expansion of their authority to cover the entire group is a request that we're making of them. Chip?
Yeah, I think to an earlier question, what happens on day 0 minus 1
Yeah.
or whatever, day 1? Your example highlights it for me very clearly. Someone in a congregation can have influence over a particular group of people that look up to that person. It can be a man or a woman.
Yeah.
That look up to that person for advice, for counsel, for comfort, for help, assistance. And so they have a sphere of influence, if you will, over a smaller group. If the congregation says, we want that person, we want that man to do that for the whole church, I think the bigger change for me is that person has to accept a different level of accountability. They may be very comfortable with the people that have naturally come to them. They may not be as willing. I think that's why one of the qualifications is they have to desire the position. But if I don't want to be responsible or accountable for everybody, so that's one of the things. Because that's what I do think changes on day 1.
Yeah.
The level of accountability is very different.
Yeah, in Hebrews 13, verse 8, the next verse there says, do these things because your leaders are responsible for your souls. Yeah. Crystal?
I think a different word for example is experience. And so leaving the spiritual realm for a minute, like Nicole knows a lot about ears. And lots of us know that she's an audiologist. But she doesn't, if she meets somebody new, she doesn't tell them she knows a lot about ears. She's like, I work with them. And so then when they say, oh, well, what do you do? Oh, I'm an audiologist. Well, then she has the authority to speak about ears to them, even though they don't know her. But if she didn't have a job there, I would still ask her about ears because I know she has experience.
Yeah, so differentiating between formal and informal authority there in some ways based on experience. Because we know someone, we may look to them, but in the broader world, they might not have authority in that way. Right. Anything else? Mr. Creel.
I'm just going to say that the very first group that he must exercise his authority well over his family, with both the potential elders and potential deacons. It's a critical. If they haven't demonstrated their ability there, they're not qualified to be elevated to a position.
Yeah. So those concepts of managing one's household well as a microcosm for the larger flock is really important for establishing how is the man going to lead in those scenarios. And when we think about as a father, issues like exasperating their children play out really importantly when we think about those men serving as elders or deacons. Because that's a familial example frequently of lording it over your little flock. Wayne?
Your question about where they will serve before and serve after. What does hearing the sheep actually look like before they're elder? Do they have the ability to sense or to know inside people's lives before they're elder?
Yes.
Like a father should know his children and know when they're troubled, even though they may not come to it. It's not audiology. It's not, oh, do you hear this sound? It is the immensity of our relationship is a lot more than do we hear each other when we're in pain? Do you know each other well enough? And I think that's a significant factor in hearing the sheep, but they have to do that before.
Yeah, that's a great segue to John 10. The second worksheet, the second page of your worksheet is going to be John 10. We'll read this and then talk about some of those concepts Wayne mentioned a little bit more. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. The specific question I want you to consider for a minute or two is written in your handout. That's, why does the shepherd have authority over the sheep here? And how do we know? Take a minute and consider that. Why does the shepherd have authority over the sheep? And how do we know that he does, based on this passage? Alan?
He cares for the sheep. He cares about every one of the sheep, and that's how he has authority over it.
Great. So he cares for the sheep. And he cares so much for the sheep, in fact, that he seeks out sheep that are shepherdless. He looks for those that he can make part of his flock. Because being part of his flock is representative of care. He sees that some sheep need care, and he wants to bring them into his fold. What else? Crystal?
He doesn't run when it's hard or scary.
Yeah, so he doesn't run when it's hard or scary. So when the wolves come, he could hightail it out of there, or he can be like David, who was the shepherd who defeated the bear and the lion and then Goliath, right? That's a great example of David had a little flock, and he cared for them by killing the bear and the lion. And then he took it on himself to actually provide similar care for everyone in Israel that he could. And he defeats Goliath in that way, right? So in that way, he takes on responsibility. He seeks out to provide care at potential loss of life, at sacrifice of himself. Jerry?
14 and 15. He knows them.
He knows them, and what? And they know him. That the shepherd can do these things because of the two-way relationship and knowledge that exists. It's not solely that he knows the sheep. Oh, that's sheep 1 and that's sheep 4. Sheep 5 is always in trouble. But the sheep know him as well. They see him, and they know who he is. He doesn't actually have to tell him that he's their shepherd. They just know. Chip?
Yeah, I was going to say something in the last section. This emphasizes it even more. This point that you're making. It's why elders in a local group, the Woodland Hills Church here, cannot have any authority over people that are not in the Woodland Hills flock, family. Now it's the Lord's flock overall, we get that. And there are people outside the flock altogether that we're trying to seek and save. But it's a great illustration of why elders here can't have any authority over another church. They don't know that.
Yeah. To know and to be known by requires proximity and time together. David, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think the idea that the sheep also listen to his voice is very important. Probably, we don't interact with sheep a lot. Probably know people who have dogs that are very obedient and listen, and dogs that don't listen. And every owner of a dog is going to say, well, obviously I have authority over my dog. But we probably all know people who were, to be honest, would be like, no, your dog is the alpha in this pack. So, like, I guess I said, it's like, if the sheep don't listen, the shepherd can care as much as he wants about the sheep and lay down his life for the sheep. But if the sheep are not listening, it's hard to make the case that the shepherd has full authority, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it makes complete sense. That all of these things are necessary for someone to fulfill the role of a shepherd. They have to sacrifice for the sheep. They have to know and be known by the sheep. They have to seek out the shepherdless. And the sheep have to listen to the shepherd's voice. If those things aren't all true, I don't think you have someone fulfilling the role of a shepherd. Micah?
Continuing in the idea of 14 through 16, the shepherd, in this case the good shepherd, gives the flock identity, that idea of like defining the identity of that flock. Like that identity is not there without the shepherd.
Yeah.
So the fact that the sheep know who their shepherd is because there is an identity there that hasn't been defined. And making the sense of elders, and then looking at a similar concept, elders are responsible or accountable for helping the flock maintain the identity that has been defined by Christ by keeping the flock on the path that keeps them identified as Christ and shows, and you can see with there being identity, those who are inside the flock and those who are not in the flock, who should be led to the flock.
Yeah, I love your comments about identity there. So we didn't lean into this really hard, but in multiple of these, the concept of example is woven through. Similarly, if you look at Acts 20, where Paul addresses the Ephesian elders, and he talks about how he was an example when he was among them, and that's why he has authority. In all of these cases, the authority is directly derived from how much of an exemplar of Christ the elder or the special servant kind of represents or replicates. That when the elder, in Micah's example, brings us identity, do they bring us identity because they bring us Christ and they act as a mirror to see Christ? Because that's how the apostles say that someone has authority, is by being that example and that reflection of Christ. When we see their life and the way it imitates Christ, we then imitate their life. And so that identity, and do they bring us identity, is directly related to, are they bringing us the identity of Christ, or are they trying to bring us to some other thing or place that may not be reflective of what it should be? Because if it is, they have an example that we shouldn't be looking to, right? They have to reflect Christ. So, as we kind of close our class this morning, I want to come back to the question of what is authority in the kingdom? And what I would tell you is authority, when we consider the discussions we've had this morning, really emanates from two ideas. One, like I just said, how closely does their example reflect Christ? If it doesn't reflect Christ, they can't have authority in the Lord's church. And second, what is their relationship with the sheep? What does that look like? Do they sacrifice? Do they have a relationship that's two-way? Do the sheep listen to their voice? And I think that last maybe metaphor about listening to the voice is one of the most important, because it helps us to identify people who are serving prior to being in a specific special servant role, and that they may be qualified to serve in a broader role for the entire congregation. Do people listen to their voice when they speak and when they call? David referenced a shepherd. One of these ideas about the shepherd, that the shepherd knowing the sheep and the sheep knowing him and listening to their voice, is, especially in the Middle East, when this was all written, shepherds would go out into the fields together. Like you might have 3 or 4 or 5 family members that all kind of have their sheep in the similar pasture area, and they might have their folds together near their homes. Then they walk out into the field together, and it would be 3, 4, 5, however many shepherds, and hundreds of sheep. Well, which sheep is which? Well, each shepherd would take their sheep to a different place to eat or drink or rest. And as they went that way, they would have a different call, a different whistle, or a different song they might sing. And the way you would differentiate, well, which sheep is Chip's and which sheep is Wayne's and which sheep is Jerry's, well, as they went to their specific place and they issued forth their call, the sheep would break apart. And the sheep that were Chip's or Wayne's or Jerry's would follow them to the place of calm and rest that they were leading them to. That's the idea of the sheep knowing the voice of their shepherd. That when that shepherd calls, the sheep just come. That's where they look for peace and for comfort. To serve with authority, a man must have those that listen to the call of his voice long before he's appointed. And if we can't identify those that are listening to the voice of a man before we ask him to serve in one of these special ways, we really have to ask ourselves, is he qualified? Can we discern that he has a flock before he has responsibility and authority for the entire flock? Now, I think there's also some discussions here that would say, part of what gives, for example, our elders authority is that we listen to their voice. And so, when they are making decisions for us, and we are following them, that means we're listening to their voice. And that means they have authority. When our elders and our members diverge, and potentially decisions or concerns are made that the congregation doesn't agree with, that may mean that we don't follow our shepherd's voice in those examples, and so they may not have authority in those cases. We grant authority as a group of sheep, and they take on the responsibility of authority. It's a two-way relationship where each is known by the other and works together to establish what this service looks like. Thank you all so much. I don't remember what we're studying next week, so I'm not going to tell you.